So we descend deeper into the Japanese history iceberg. If you haven't seen the Tier 1 video yet, I suggest you check it out here. Japan is a country with a strange history, and there's plenty of odd stuff to go over. There are a few you likely have a vague knowledge of, but it's getting stranger and stranger still. Let's start this tier with Japan's own Watergate, the Lockheed Incident. As the Vietnam War was wrapping up, the plane manufacturer Lockheed, now known as Lockheed Martin, was suffering from a severe downturn. Part of the issue is that compared to their military aviation programs, their civilian program wasn't very popular. Their big gamble, the L-1011 TriStar, had stiff competition, and they knew that they would need to make big sales to back up their investment into the state-of-the-art airliner that they produced.
It's the most advanced plane ever built. In fact, it uses some of the same technology that landed men on the moon.
So, they did what they needed to do, bribing literally everyone they could to sell their planes. One of their targets was All Nippon Airways. This is actually something that had been done before in the early 1950s to sell military jets, and now they hoped they could do the same for their own airliners. What resulted was one of the most bizarre and circuitous paths through murky CIA connections, former agents for the occupation of Japan, Japanese underworld figures, and then finally to former war criminal Kodama Yoshio. Kodama was the top political fixer in Japan at the time, possessing a strong influence in the Japanese criminal underworld and close connections to both the CIA and the Japanese government. If you wanted something done, Kodama could get it done. All you needed was money. Having first taken part in a coup at the age of only 18, Kodama's influence represented over 40 years of involvement in smuggling and backroom politics. The country's prime minister, Tanaka Kakue, was also involved at the center of the scheme, actually receiving funds from Lockheed via 3 different sources: Kodama, businessman Osano Kenji, and the Japanese trading firm Marubeni. This whole scheme was unraveled when the Church Subcommittee in the Senate revealed in 1975 that Lockheed had thrown around bribes like they were in Magic City. Pretty much immediately, Kodama's role was discovered as he had been paid large sums labeled consulting fees. Genius. Which then made the pathway through Kodama to Tanaka quite easy to figure out. A political firestorm erupted in Japan that rocked the political establishment there, revealing for the first time since the 1950s how dirty their politics could get. And even more significant, it was broadcast on television. This leads us on to our next topic, the porno kamikaze. You might have heard of this before. Sometimes he's referred to as an actor, but Maeno Soichiro was prominent mostly in a particular genre called Romano porno. You're probably saying, Charlie, I want to learn more about it, please tell me. I would say, well, that's suspicious. But yes, Maeno had gotten some roles in film, but really saw his greatest success in the film industry acting in what were a very popular subgenre of softcore pornography, made by a film studio called Nikatsu. In the early 1970s, Nikatsu was looking at financial ruin, and so they decided to make anything to make money. This led them to making softcore films, the first being in a film called Apartment Wife, Afternoon Liaison. Ooh, sounds fun. Maeno starred in the film as a marital aid salesman. Maeno's life hadn't turned out like he had hoped. He had done some action films, but 2 failed marriages and a career that consisted mostly of supporting roles in softcore films seemed to break him. After a failed suicide attempt, the Lockheed Incident became the focus of his attention. You see, what was unique about Maeno was that he was a hard-right nationalist and also a fan of Mishima Yukio, who had passed away several years prior in a failed coup attempt at Ichigaya Barracks in Tokyo. Protests against Kodama Yoshio had been frequent in the aftermath of the incident. Kodama had been holed up at his Tokyo mansion and his whereabouts were well known. Public attention was hyper-fixated on Kodama and his career. Under the guise of flying his private Cessna for a film, Maeno dressed in a kamikaze uniform, wrapped a headband around his head bearing the same nationalist slogan as Mishima, and took a commemorative photo before departure. After taking off, he shouted "Tenno Heika Banzai" over the radio and cut communications.
3月23日、児玉市の家に特攻隊員スタイルの映画俳優が小型飛行機を操縦して突入する事件が起きました。別の部屋にいた児玉氏は背負われて逃げ、難を逃れました。
Next up is the Mishima Incident. If you followed my content, you're likely aware of the very long documentary that I've made about Mishima, so if you're interested in more about Mishima, I'd suggest you check out that video. So I'll just keep things short here. Mishima was one of the most successful and talented post-war writers in Japan, but as much as the typewriter called to him, so did politics. Mishima became a leader of a group called the Tate no Kai, or Shield Society, and as the 1960s went along, Mishima became more convinced of the necessity to defend his country from the radical New Left students. However, after this leftist high-water margin subsided, Mishima was left alienated and seemingly without political purpose. Having finished his crowning achievement, the fertility of the sea tetralogy, Mishima and a crew of 4 other members entered the barracks at Camp Ichigaya in the center of Tokyo. They tied up the commander and Mishima made a speech which wasn't heard by the assembled soldiers. Instead, they mocked and jeered him. Mishima returned to the commander's office and committed seppuku, followed by one of the other Tate no Kai members, Morita Masakatsu. There's a lot more to the story, and I go into excruciating detail in my documentary, including Mishima's interest in the 226 incident. The 226 incident was the largest and most dramatic of all coup attempts against the pre-war Japanese government, the crowning jewel, if you will. It represented the culmination of well over a decade of tension inside the Japanese army, split between the radical Kodoha, which sought to institute a Showa restoration, to take back the country from big businesses who bought political parties with ease, and the Toseiha, who liked the conservative establishment just fine, thank you very much. The Kodoha were primarily younger officers, young men with desires to rid Japan of its corrupt and venial political class and rise up the army's rungs, which were blocked by older and aristocratic members. Starting off in the 1920s, as Japan's post-World War I economic troubles only seemed to get worse, a desire for firm nationalism on the world stage and policy to fix the various perceived ills in the country reached a fever pitch, resulting in several assassinations of prime ministers and other high-ranking members of the Japanese government. A group of Kodoha nationalist officers in Tokyo made the fateful decision to draw up targets for assassination as part of a coup plot to take control of the Japanese government. On a snowy morning one day, Japanese army troops departed from their barracks and occupied several buildings, including the headquarters of the liberal Asahi Shimbun newspaper. But they weren't going to stop there. The targets on their list were hunted down one by one, with the troops visiting them in the early morning, hoping to catch them unaware. However, in spite of the scale of the bloodshed, the coup plot failed. The plotters failed to secure support from any element in or around the imperial family and other parts of the army, thus leaving them without support. The soldiers surrendered and their leaders committed seppuku. This put an end to the coups in Japan. The known radical officers were transferred away from each other, and their leaders were forcibly retired. One of its leading intellectuals, a man by the name of Kita Iki, was sentenced to death, more as a show of force than anything else. Thus, the Kodoha was defeated. As I mentioned, this wasn't the only plot that the nationalists tried. In fact, they once tried to assassinate Charlie Chaplin. And I'm not joking when I say this, there really was a plot to assassinate movie star Charlie Chaplin. It was part of a wider event known as the May 15th incident, which itself was connected to the League of Blood incident. There were a lot of coups in Japan, especially after the invasion of Manchuria in 1931. The League of Blood incident and the 515 incident were among the few times that the Navy men turned out to be the radicals. Most of the time the radicals were in the army. The IJA, Imperial Japanese Army, was highly aristocratic and had a much more nationalist culture to the organization than the nation's navy. The London Navy Treaty that limited Japan's navy wasn't particularly popular among the navy, let's just keep it at that. The League of Blood killed Mitsui executive Dan Takumi, and the 515 incident followed not long after, targeting Prime Minister Inokai Tsuyoshi, and none other than Charlie Chaplin. Chaplin, as it turns out, was a bit of a weeaboo, and visited Japan quite a few times. During one visit, Chaplin was to be greeted by Prime Minister Inokai. At that meeting, Inokai and Chaplin were to be both assassinated, in the hope that that would throw the Japanese government into disarray and cause a war with the United States, thus providing the basis for the Showa restoration. It seems that because he was in American movies, he was seen to be an American by the Japanese. That's kinda racist, Japanese far-right ultra-nationalists. Kinda racist indeed. While 11 of the rebels managed to snuff out Prime Minister Inokai, Charlie Chaplin was safe and sound watching a sumo match. The officers were court-martialed for what they did, but they ended up gaining sympathy from the public as well-meaning patriots. Over 100,000 petitions for clemency rolled in during the trial, and they were given light sentences. This particular assassination attempt occurred before the 226 incident, and the lightness of the punishments likely influenced the eagerness of the putschists in that subsequent coup attempt. Now let's touch on something that I had mentioned, the corruption of the government during that time. Zaibatsu Politics. It's no secret that in any capitalist society, the organizations or businesses with big banks have more influence than the average person. Few countries are like the US, where it ends up being enshrined in the legal system. In pre-war Japan, corruption was pretty much just part of the democratic institution. It wasn't uncommon for outright criminals to be elected to the Diet. Since 1900, the largest and most influential party was the conservative Rikken Yoseikai. They were the embodiment of the pre-war conservative capitalist establishment, finding heavy background support from Mitsui, Yasuda, and the Shibusawa Zaibatsus. Their main opposition from 1927 was the Rikken Yoseikai, who were slightly to their left. They had a strong backing from Mitsubishi. These Zaibatsus had an incredible level of influence over the economy, and thus over Japan's monetary policy and its politics. After all, bribes were nice, but overbearing influence over every financial aspect of the government was another thing entirely. Soft power is not to be underrated, my friends. These companies dominated and monopolized in the Japanese market, damaging small producers and using Japan's economy as a springboard to launch further ventures abroad into China, specifically Manchuria. Even beyond the partisan political system, the Zaibatsus had a high level of influence, possessing a key stranglehold on political decision-making in the country, and in turn, the political establishment held firm with the Zaibatsu's backing. You can see how people who were reformers or wanted some level of political change in the system would come to see the Zaibatsus as a deleterious influence on Japan. For our next entry, we'll be doing Women Are Unclean? Okay, maybe let's not go with that title. How about Women Are Unclean is something believed by the Japanese traditionally. Traditional Japanese religious thought, that is to say Shintoism, places a high degree of importance on purity and cleanliness. This is actually really similar to Judaism, at least in my limited understanding of Judaism. This is, for example, why when you visit a Shinto shrine, you wash your hands. Just like Judaism, this deep obsession with cleanliness led to adverse effects on women because of their menstrual cycle. In Judaism, it's more strict, but in traditional Shinto beliefs, there's a similar set of things that they can't do. Women were seen as dirty and couldn't enter some holy places while menstruating or even at all, before noted feminist ally Emperor Meiji. In the modern day, however, it doesn't seem like most people are certain if it is a rule you have to follow or not. Additionally, on the Mount of Sanjogatake, in the Nara Prefecture, the Buddhist Shinto syncretic religious tradition of Shugendo bans the entry of women onto its peak. This is also the headquarters of the sect. It's the last gender-based discrimination based around religion that's allowed in Japan. Well, other than in the very Shinto sport of sumo. On the dohyo, that is the ring in sumo, women aren't allowed to enter, at least according to the main Japan Sumo Association. A few times for various reasons, usually to present awards, women have asked to enter the dohyo, but were rejected each and every time. Attitudes had changed, and in 2018, a fairly major event would occur inside the ring, one that would make headlines even in the West. The mayor of Maizuru, Tatami Ryozo, suddenly collapsed in the dohyo. A registered nurse emerged from the crowd and immediately began to give chest compressions as it was clear that it was serious. It turned out later that he had a brain hemorrhage. Over the loudspeaker, a judge made the call for the nurse and the other women to leave the dohyo, despite the nurse being in the process of saving the mayor's life. The idea that gender would matter in a life or death situation shocked a lot of people. In fact, pretty much everybody in Japan and people abroad too. The incident sparked a new debate about some of the still lingering traditional attitudes to women in Japan. Now that we've talked about Zaibatsus, we've talked about dirty women, let's talk about brothers. The two brother prime ministers, Kishi Nobusuke and Sato Eisaku. Now when I say brother, I don't mean
two bros chilling in the hot tub, 5 feet apart cause they're not gay.
I'm talking about brothers by blood. Their surnames are different, but the blood is the same. Both of them grew up in the rural and conservative prefecture of Yamaguchi, down in the south of Japan. Their family had fallen on hard times and had to rely on his uncle to help put Kishi through school. Back then, still Sato Nobusuke. He lived in Okayama with his uncle, but his uncle's sudden death meant that he had to go home. Afterwards, he returned home to Yamaguchi with his cousin Sato Hiroko. Sato Nobusuke would then take on the surname of his wife's family, Kishi, becoming Kishi Nobusuke. This is where things get really confusing for the Sato Kishi dynasty, because his younger brother, Sato Eisaku, kept the surname Sato, and I was very confused for a little bit because the family tree made no sense to me, but it turns out that his cousin that returned with Kishi, Sato Hiroko, married Sato Eisaku. Cousin marriage. Sweet home Yamaguchi, where the skies are so blue. Both Kishi Nobusuke and Sato Eisaku became Prime Minister later on in life. Shortly after Kishi's time in charge, Sato Eisaku became the Prime Minister in 1964 until 1972, making him one of the longest-lasting Prime Ministers. Kishi's daughter Yoko married Abe Shintaro, the son of Abe Khan, a powerful Yamaguchi-based politician who died rather young. Thus, the emerging of the Sato-Kishi dynasties into the Sato-Kishi-Abe dynasty. If it wasn't for his early death at the age of only 67, Abe Shintaro would have likely been Prime Minister as well. His son, Abe Shinzo, was the Prime Minister, taking the Sato-Kishi-Abe dynasty to 3 Prime Ministers. They have numerous other members of their dynasty who have also entered politics, their latest being Kishi Nobucho, who was elected to the Diet in 2023. There are some other dynasties in Japanese politics: the Fukuda dynasty, the Yoshida Asao dynasty, the Kono dynasty, and the Tanaka dynasty, and so on. However, the Sato-Kishi-Abe dynasty appears to be dying out. Neither of the sons of Kishi or Sato Eisaku had sons. Instead, the family lived on through the Abe family, until Abe Shinzo died without any children. The last branch are Abe dynasty members biologically, but they have the last name of Kishi as a result of an adoption, just like Kishi originally. Okay, enough about normal people. Dr. Nakamatsu, or rather Dr. Nakamatsu. Dr. Nakamatsu is up there as far as absolutely bizarre Japanese political figures, although his primary interest is in inventing things. Usually weird things that don't typically seem to work, or things that deal with sex, like his love jet system. He did, however, invent the siphon pump to pump soy sauce out of bottles. However, instead of soy sauce, people use it to manually pump heating oil from containers. So that's a good invention. Outside of the number of patents he supposedly filed, his most famous claim to fame is having created the floppy disk. This wasn't something that he actually created, and the technology was already existent by that time. IBM licensed several of his patents, surprisingly, but not that one. So he didn't invent the floppy disk. There are plenty of people with other videos who've done far better coverage of him, and there's only so much I can do about him without feeling like you should check out the other videos of him. But the thing we're focusing more on here today is Dr. Nakamatsu's interesting contributions to Japanese politics. He's well known as a perennial candidate, always running in one election or another. In 1990, he was encouraged to enter politics, and did so for the first time in 1991 as an independent for the Tokyo governorship. In 1992, he ran again, this time for the House of Councilors, for the Innovation Politics Party title that he made for himself. In 1993 and 1995, he got over 20% of the vote and was the focus of news reports. But this was the limit of his success. He never got more than 20% ever again, and gradually stopped being seen as a viable candidate. Between 1995 and 2014, he ran for office 12 times. 2 times for the far-right Happiness Realization Party, which is the political vehicle for the Happy Science cult. And now at the age of 96, the good Dr. Nakamatsu has decided to run for office yet again. And you think Biden's too old? Well, at least he doesn't think he's Jesus, because yes, there's a guy in Japan who thinks he's Jesus Matayoshi. It might surprise you, but somehow Jesus wasn't nearly as interesting as Dr. Nakamatsu. He was born and raised in Okinawa, but lives in Tokyo, so initially he ran races both in Tokyo and also down in his native Okinawa. He was very far right, wanting to send home all the ethnic minorities in Japan regardless of their status of citizenship, and wanting to remove the US presence in Okinawa. His ideology was some sort of weird conservative collectivism where everything was owned and produced in common. Communism, if you will. Honestly, it was all very weird and aggressive and nonsensical. He had done some work for the World Council of Churches and gotten fairly deep into Protestant Christianity, and in the mid-90s he returned to his hometown in Okinawa. After a failed protest movement there against land reclamation efforts, he felt like he was becoming God. As one does. During the 1996 embassy siege in Peru, the Japanese embassy there, he went to Peru to attempt to negotiate with the guerrillas. Upon his return, he formed the World Economic Collective Party and started to run in elections. Since 1997, he ran in a total of 17 elections, rarely getting more than 5,000 votes. Awfully sad, but no one is crying more than the crying politician. You've probably seen this guy before. His name is Nonomura Ryutaro. He left the civil service and entered politics in 2007. However, he had trouble getting a base of support. People weren't buying what he was selling. Every time he was ending up in last. Somehow, unfortunately for everyone, he was elected to the Hyogo Prefectural Assembly in 2011, despite only receiving 8% of the vote. For a time, this was enough for our old pal Nonomura, but Nonomura didn't know his limits. Soon questions about his expenses, specifically with different trips he had alleged to have taken. When people looked into it and compared it with all his other activities, they found it would have been impossible for Nonomura to have taken all of his trips. Something was rotten in Denmark, and also Hyogo. He called a press conference as a last-ditch effort to save himself, but it went badly. The video became a huge meme online, crossing over even into the foreign internet due to Nonomura's extreme crying. He even ended up being parodied on Gintama. Soon after, he had resigned and returned the funds that he defrauded. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison with 4 years suspended for his crimes. Since leaving prison, Nonomura has had serious trouble finding work. So he started up an online radio show where he discusses anime among other things, and the most eye-catching thing that he's done is his new employment: life coach and fortune teller, apparently. He has advertised his services online, promising an astrological and numerological fortune telling for a little more than $10, though his life coaching is just over $90. If Nonomura ever offers you life coaching, say no. Get it? It's a joke. The Rikken Yoseikai are one of the few parties in Japan, and by few, I mean legally speaking, the only political party to elect candidates in both the pre- and post-war eras of Japan. But how Rikken Yoseikai managed this is unknown. The Japanese political scene was rearranged with the liberalization of speech and the political purging brought forth by MacArthur. For whatever reason, the Rikken Yoseikai didn't need to worry about this and didn't have to deal with it. I don't know, they were lucky, who knows. But the Rikken Yoseikai was first formed in 1923 by Nichiren Buddhist leader Tanaka Chigaku. Tanaka had developed something called Nichirenism, which essentially takes Nichiren Buddhism and Japanese nationalism and then smashes it together. The ultimate goal was the idea of taking a national shrine or temple and converting the imperial family to Nichiren Buddhism and then making it the state religion. Although Tanaka Chigaku was largely anti-war and against the death penalty, his son, who would later become the Rikken Yoseikai leader in 1929, took it in an even more radically nationalist direction. After over 15 years of struggle, the Rikken Yoseikai managed to get someone elected to the Diet, a man named Tanaka Ko. Tanaka refused to join the Imperial Rule Assistance Association and criticized the policies of the IRAA, resulting in the organization's banning in 1942. The party was reformed after World War II, though the old leader was purged by the occupation authorities. The Rikken Yoseikai somehow managed to escape being purged. In spite of this still being a nationalist outfit, somehow the organization escaped and just wasn't ever banned. In 1947, Japan had its first election under the new constitution and elected a candidate in 1947 and 48 from the Rikken Yoseikai party. Unfortunately, okay, maybe not unfortunately, they haven't elected anyone since. This made Rikken Yoseikai the only political party to be elected both before and after the war. It survived as a political organization until 2013 when the group stopped filing earnings statements. Speaking of pre- and post-war Japan, the American Constitution is awfully controversial among certain types. You see, the Japanese Constitution was mostly written by the US. Immediately after the war, Japanese politicians were resistant to the idea of making a new constitution or even the level of MacArthur's influence. Legal arguments and appeals to the Hague Conventions aside, MacArthur was the deciding factor in most things. Just like land reform in Japan, MacArthur was leading the show. From before the end of 1945, there were already serious proposals for a new constitution being circulated. No less than 7 were created and announced by the Japanese. However, ultimately the deciding factor was the MacArthur draft. On February 3, 1947, MacArthur released his 3 principles that outlined the goals of the new constitution. This would end the emperor system and make the emperor symbolic, enforce pacifism in the constitution, and end the concept of nobility outside the imperial family. MacArthur handed off work to a part of the occupation force known as GS, or Government Section, to create a draft. GS was heavily staffed with left-wing Democrats and supporters of the New Deal. The 2 main men who wrote the MacArthur draft, Courtney Whitney and Milo Rowell, went to work. They attempted to take elements of the already existent Meiji Constitution, current political concerns, and necessary liberalizations and merge them all together to form a cohesive document. 11 days later, the draft was completed, and soon the deliberation with the House of Representatives and the Diet began. The resulting constitution was different in text, but largely had the same intentions and meanings behind the words. Regardless, despite being largely created by the US, the constitution was approved by the Japanese Diet and became the official constitution today. Certain figures, largely on the left initially, disapproved of the constitution for a variety of reasons. One of these reasons was the emperor system. Some people wanted Emperor Hirohito, known as the Showa Emperor, to abdicate. And by some people I mean to say that by 1945, That was pretty much everybody. As part of taking responsibility for the war and for the sake of fixing Japan's awful situation, people began to consider the idea of the emperor abdicating and just liquidating the imperial fortune outright. The Communist Party, of course, had their idea of removing the monarchy entirely, and the US occupation was incredibly negative towards traditional Japanese culture, as they believed that Japanese militarism and imperialism was derived from those traditional elements. Believe it or not, it has been revealed through the discovery of a diary of former Imperial Household Agency head Hajime Michiji that Hirohito himself believed that he would have to step down to atone for what had been done. Numerous pretenders had even written to the occupation authorities, requesting that they be placed on the throne in Hirohito's stead. Regardless of who ended up on the throne after Hirohito, there would have to be some interesting legal challenges to the very concept of abdication. Due to the wording of the old Imperial Household Act in the Session Code, it was actually understood to be unconstitutional by some scholars, and Hirohito would be essentially legally incapable of abdicating, actually. The same can be said of the Household Act implemented after World War II, which made no mention of abdication as a possibility. Ultimately, in 2017, the Household Act was amended to allow the Heisei Emperor, Akihito, to abdicate. But why didn't Hirohito abdicate? What changed? Then, translator for MacArthur, Fabian Bowers, explained how important Emperor Hirohito and MacArthur's first meeting was to avoid abdication.
And then, at that point, MacArthur, who had been standing further in, walked very strongly towards him and said, "You are very, very welcome, sir," and took the emperor both hands, both of his hands in the emperor's one hand. The emperor's hand was shaking like that, trembling, and he bowed very low so that the handshake was over his head. He thought he might have come to sort of save his skin, so to speak, but instead the emperor had offered himself as a Mingawari. Kill me, but not those who acted in my name. And MacArthur was so astonished by that he knew from that moment that here was a very precious man that had to be preserved for many, many reasons. And he did.
Now, Bowers had been accused of overstating his influence on saving kabuki in Japan. That's a whole other story, but even taking with a grain of salt, this story is a pretty significant testament. Obviously, historically, the emperor did not fall upon the sword for the men who had served him. Rather, this meeting and the growing sense that the emperor was a pacifying force of the country led to MacArthur, and consequently the occupation itself, to turn away from removing Hirohito. With the passing of time and the fading of the reformist fervor, desire to force Hirohito's abdication went from a common viewpoint to extreme fringe in a matter of years. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East avoided involving Hirohito at all. What Hirohito was actually responsible for or not is a debate to be held another time. I'm not going to be covering that here. Instead, we're going to discuss one of Japan's most unique agents, a woman known as Eastern Jewel. Eastern Jewel was the 14th daughter of a Qing nobleman named Sanchi. Sanchi was close to a man who was a policing expert based in China named Kawashima Naniwa. Sanchi was decidedly pro-Japanese, but Kawashima's dream was to separate China and Manchuria in order to form a separate Manchurian state. However, after the 1911 revolution against the Qing dynasty, he had to return to Japan. In time, however, Sanchi planned to hand over his daughter to Kawashima. The girl, sometimes known by her courtesy name, Eastern Jewel, was 7 at the time. Later, she would take the name Kawashima Yoshiko. To the surprise of no one, she never had a close relationship to her father, given that she was his 14th daughter. Her mother, however, became an object of her affection, and later in life, Eastern Jewel stated that she believed that her mother may have had Japanese heritage. During those days, Kawashima Naniwa still had a great deal of influence, and he worked to organize the Royalist Party in China and Japan, a political party dedicated to restoring the Manchus back to the throne. Obviously, this didn't work out. During the 1917 restoration attempt of the young emperor, Eastern Jewel was brought along. Though she had trouble adapting to life in Japan at first, by then she was reportedly looking like a Japanese girl rather than a Chinese one. This was the last time that her mother would see her. After the failed restoration, she returned to Japan with Kawashima and entered middle school. She did poorly in school, spending most of her time riding her horse rather than attending classes, reportedly. In 1922, her father and then mother died in quick succession. Shortly thereafter, her adoptive father, Kawashima Naniwa, assaulted her. Thereafter, Eastern Jewel's mental state went left in a bad way, with her shaving her head almost bald, and then she shot herself in her chest. Somehow, she managed to survive. But in doing so, she had decided to become a man. Kind of. She went as far as to publish her decision to throw away her womanhood in newspapers, and soon she became an object of curiosity. The situation had gotten so extreme that she had become somewhat of a celebrity and had fans of her own, deciding to go to Shanghai and visit a brother of hers. With her brother's assent, she married the son of a Mongol prince, but this relationship lasted a short time before she moved back to Shanghai. There, she had become involved in spying. The actual details of these activities remain shrouded in mystery, and there's plenty of uncertainties. This is partly because of the publishing of a book with a character based off of her, published in 1932. Using her name and likeness, the book propelled her to a new level of popularity. It's likely that she was used mostly for her ties to Manchu and Mongol nobility rather than any in-person operations. Now, as a popular figure, she was doing radio broadcasts and even had records put out with her singing. In truth, she was a propaganda tool, so when she began to criticize the Japanese military authorities, she was iced out of public life entirely. From 1937 onwards, she became the proprietress of a restaurant in Tianjin, leading out a relatively quiet existence, suffering in the newfound solitude that her life afforded her. In 1945, after the war between China and Japan ended, she was captured. Because she was never formally adopted by Kawashima, she was tried as a traitor rather than a war criminal. She was executed in 1949. Now that we're diving deeper, it's about time we start talking about the Japanese radical left. Anti-Japaneseism will be our first venture into that subject. The East Asian Anti-Japan Armed Front was formed in the early 1970s as the Japanese student movement began to wrap up. The Vietnam War was flaming out, and nothing of real substance had been done by the student radicals, meaning that most were entering another phase of their life. However, a small number of radicals were determined to carry on with the fight. Among them was a small group of university students from Hosei University. They had come under the influence of anti-Japanese currents at the time, believing that as Japanese, they had to make eternal atonement for the past. They went as far to refer to the Japanese as a criminal race and essentially advocated for self-genocide, which is pretty absurd. No one expects the Mongolians to make eternal atonement for Genghis Khan. This was kind of a culmination of the New Left's thesis that Japan was benefiting from American imperialism in Korea and then in Vietnam, similar to how it benefited off of its own imperialism. Among the figures that they came under the influence of was a man named Ota Ryu, arguably the most insane person in the Japanese New Left, and that's really saying something. Japan during the 1960s and 70s was doing fairly well economically, so the radical left was growing annoyed at the supposed class of supporters, the proletariat. Instead, the proletariat were no longer interested in revolution, and thus, the nucleus of the revolution would have to be shifting to disaffected parts of Japan, namely the Ainu, day laborers, Burakumin, Sainichi Koreans, and people from Okinawa. Ota worked to establish close relations with the Ainu and Okinawa nationalists, essentially to create nationally revolutionary movements there, but in reality they would become the vanguard for a revolution that would overthrow the Japanese government, not one that would liberate their particular region. It was all bullshit, is what I'm trying to say. This was partly influential on the East Asian Anti-Japan Armed Front, which is why the police initially thought that Ota was behind the attacks himself. Their first attack was in Shizuoka, blowing up a memorial stone for the so-called Seven Warriors. Of course, these were Class A war criminals. They followed this up about a half a year later, bombing in Osueri, that's a place where you put bones, in Kanagawa, and then a statue in Hokkaido. You might say, honestly, these guys seem weird, but not bad. They haven't hurt anyone yet, and they're just blowing up random monuments with really, really bad backstories. Well, it gets worse. These were just the tests for the actual armed struggle that they were planning. This resulted in the Rainbow Strategy, the plan to blow up Emperor Hirohito's train. Ultimately, the plot was foiled, but they followed it up with a bombing on the Mitsubishi headquarters, killing 8 and wounding over 375. They went on to describe those hurt in the attacks, not as innocents, but as colonizers. The group didn't have a single leader and was not a united organization, they were anarchists, but rather 3 different armed groups: Wolf, Earthfang, and Scorpion. Unlike the other radical left terror groups, they didn't participate in bank robberies to raise funds, but rather worked normal jobs. Given the small size and relative closeness of the small groups, none of the violent purges that happened in other groups ever occurred for these people. The group continued doing their bombings, doing 8 in total and wounding an additional 33 in total. Most of the group was arrested in 1975 in one single swoop. with the remaining small portion being freed in the Dhaka hijacking incident by the Japanese Red Army. Contrasting the East Asian anti-Japan armed front is the Japanese Red Army. Unlike the anarchist and non-sectarian roots of the anti-Japan armed front, the Japanese Red Army were all descendants of the Bund. In fact, its roots are so deep in that scene that there are two separate groups called the Japanese Red Army. Technically three if you consider the original faction as part of the Second Bund, which was in opposition to various trad organizations in the Japanese Communist Party in addition to the government itself. Okay, so the Japanese radical left was filled with numerous small groups all splitting and forming together, so I won't be going to the depths of all that bullshit. Basically, the original Red Army faction was the most radical of the radical students, even going as far to attack other far-left leaders to seize control of leadership positions. They decided to form a quote-unquote Red Army to destroy the government to bring about the revolution. This, however, required a couple different prerequisites, resulting in the so-called PBM strategy. The P being Pegasus, a plan to release their leader and establish a base in China, the B being Morocco, to launch a simultaneous terror attack on the US and Japan. The P and B never occurred, but the M, Mafia, was put into effect. This was a series of robberies to get financing for their little revolution. They engaged in a series of riots against the government and soon began to train on the mountains for a new and daring plan. Armed with pipe bombs, knives, and Molotov cocktails, the group would take dump trucks and charge into the Prime Minister's residence and the Metropolitan Police Department. Once there, they would take hostages and then they would secure the release of any of their captive comrades. However, at the base they established at a hiking lodge, the police descended on them and most of the leadership was arrested. The resulting discussion, coming to believe in the quote-unquote international base strategy to escape the Japanese authorities, caused the formation of the Japanese Red Army, which went to Palestine. There they perpetrated a heinous massacre at Lode Airport and were involved in numerous terror incidents until the late 1980s. Their leader, Shikinobu Fusako, was recently released from jail in 2022. Another group, sometimes called the Yodogo Group, hijacked a plane and flew to North Korea. Since then, most of the members have been effectively made prisoners there in North Korea, totally brainwashed and kept as prisoners in the place that they were supposed to make their base of their revolution. The other, final group that came out of the Red Army faction was the so-called United Red Army. The United Red Army had money from the robberies, but no weapons. The Japanese Communist Party Revolutionary Left-Wing Kanagawa Prefectural Committee, yes, that was their name, had plenty of weapons after robbing our gun store, so they made friends, real quick. While the Red Army was originally Trotskyite, they were heavy on the revolution and light on the Trotsky. So they merged with the other group. They took on a decidedly more Maoist tint in their ideology. The incompatibility between these two ideologies, the fact that the two groups didn't really know each other, and the radicalism of the group would cause a horrific tragedy. The group decided to make a mountain base in Gunma to evade the police. There in the mountains, the leadership of the group began a bloody purge of their own ranks, killing 12 of their own members via freezing, beating, and strangulation. Soon, however, the police had found them and several members were arrested. The remaining members, who could escape, fled to the Asano Sanso Lodge, which became a major police standoff and hostage incident. It was broadcast live on television and had a high level of viewership in Japan. This incident and the Lode Airport massacre destroyed whatever popular sympathy the far left had in Japan. Alright folks, that's it. Tier 2 is through. On Tier 3 there will be even weirder and even more obscure events for me to cover. If you liked this video, please leave a like and maybe share it with someone else who might also enjoy it. If you have a comment, feel free to leave one down below. If you want to support me further, the links are in the description. Thank you for your consideration. Also, do check out my Twitch. I usually stream on Wednesdays, Fridays, Saturdays, and sometimes Sundays, typically starting at around 2 PM EST. But without further ado, check out this video. It's pretty good. Good stories only. Thank you.